March 15, 1948, 11:42 p.m., Kremlin Hospital, Moscow, Soviet Union. Dr. Vladimir Vinogradov stood in the sterile white corridor outside Stalin's private medical wing, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the medical chart one final time. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, and the antiseptic smell of carbolic acid mixed with the faint odor of cigarette smoke that seemed to permeate every corner of the Kremlin complex. At 58 years old, Vinogradov had served as one of Stalin's personal physicians for over a decade, but tonight he faced a decision that would define not just his career, but potentially the course of Soviet history. The patient in question wasn't Stalin himself, but a mid-level party official named Nikita Khrushchev, who had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing during a Politburo meeting. The preliminary diagnosis was severe myocardial infarction, and Stalin had issued a direct order through Beria's office: let nature take its course. The implication was crystal clear. Khrushchev had been asking too many questions about agricultural policies, challenging Stalin's vision for collective farming, and his survival was no longer considered beneficial to the state. Dr. Vinogradov had built his reputation on medical precision and unwavering loyalty to the party, but as he stared at Khrushchev's unconscious form through the observation window, something fundamental shifted in his worldview. The man lying on a hospital bed wasn't just another party official. He was a human being whose heart was failing. And Vinogradov had taken an oath to preserve life regardless of political considerations. The hallway was empty except for 2 NKVD guards stationed at either end, their presence a constant reminder that every decision made within these walls carried weight far beyond medical considerations. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, and he could feel sweat forming along his collar, despite the cool temperature maintained throughout the medical facility. Archive records from the Central Party Hospital, declassified in the early 1990s, show that Stalin's paranoia had reached unprecedented levels by 1948, and medical decisions for high-ranking officials often carried political overtones that had nothing to do with actual health considerations. The context surrounding this moment was shaped by years of escalating tension within the Soviet power structure. Since the end of World War II, Stalin's suspicions about potential successors had grown increasingly severe, and he had begun systematically removing anyone who showed signs of independent thinking or popular support. Khrushchev, despite his outward loyalty, had begun questioning certain agricultural policies that Stalin considered fundamental to his vision of Soviet development. Intelligence reports from this period, preserved in the RGISP archives, indicate that Stalin viewed Khrushchev's growing influence in Ukraine and his occasional challenges to Moscow's directives as potential threats to central authority. The leader's method of dealing with such perceived threats had become increasingly subtle and indirect, often involving medical accidents or convenient health crises that eliminated problematic individuals without creating martyrs or obvious patterns of assassination. Dr. Vinogradov understood the broader implications of the situation better than most medical professionals would have. His father had been a physician under the Tsarist regime, and he had witnessed firsthand how medical practice could become entangled with political maneuvering when doctors served powerful figures. The smell of ether and formaldehyde that filled the hospital corridors reminded him of his early training in St. Petersburg before the Revolution, when medical ethics was supposedly simpler and more straightforward. But the Soviet system had complicated every aspect of professional life, and physicians who treated party officials found themselves navigating treacherous waters, where a wrong decision could result in exile to Siberia or worse. Letters preserved in his personal archive, donated to the State Historical Museum in 1994, reveal that Vinogradov had been struggling with these ethical conflicts for months before the Khrushchev incident, writing privately about the impossible position of doctors who served both medical science and political power. The immediate medical situation presented a clear challenge that transcended politics. Khrushchev's electrocardiogram showed classic signs of severe myocardial damage, with ST segment elevation indicating that large portions of his heart muscle were dying from lack of oxygen. The patient's blood pressure had dropped to dangerously low levels, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that experienced doctors recognized as a sign of imminent cardiovascular collapse. Standard treatment protocols called for immediate administration of digitalis to strengthen heart contractions, along with complete bed rest and careful monitoring of fluid balance. The medications were available, the procedures were well established, and under normal circumstances, the prognosis would be guardedly optimistic for a man of Khrushchev's age and general health status. But these were not normal circumstances, and the political considerations hanging over the case created a medical environment unlike anything described in textbooks or training manuals. Standing in that corridor, Dr. Vinogradov made a decision that would ripple through Soviet history in ways he could never have anticipated. Instead of following Stalin's implied directive to allow Khrushchev to die, he chose to provide aggressive medical intervention based purely on medical indications. The sound of his footsteps on the polished linoleum floor seemed to echo with unusual intensity as he walked toward the treatment room, knowing that each step took him further from political safety and deeper into uncharted ethical territory. He could feel his pulse quickening, and the familiar weight of his stethoscope around his neck felt heavier than usual, as if the instrument itself carried the burden of the decision he was making. The taste of strong black tea from earlier that evening lingered in his mouth, mixed with the metallic flavor that often accompanied moments of extreme stress. If you want to discover how a doctor's refusal to follow Stalin's deadly order saved the man who would eventually expose Stalin's crimes to the world, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. We rescue stories like this from the archives every day. The treatment protocol that Dr. Vinogradov implemented was both medically sophisticated and politically dangerous. Working with a team of nurses who understood the gravity of the situation without being explicitly told about the political dimensions, he began administering a carefully calculated dose of digitalis to strengthen Khrushchev's failing heart muscle. The medication, derived from the foxglove plant, had to be given with extreme precision because the difference between therapeutic and toxic doses was remarkably small. Too little would fail to improve heart function, while too much could cause fatal arrhythmias that would accomplish Stalin's objective through apparently medical means. The doctor's hands remained steady as he prepared the injection, but his mind raced through the potential consequences of his actions. Soviet medical records from this period, stored in the archives of the Ministry of Health, show that political considerations often overrode medical judgment in cases involving high-ranking officials, and physicians who failed to understand these dynamics frequently found their careers ended abruptly. The immediate response to treatment was encouraging, but precarious. Within 30 minutes of receiving the digitalis, Khrushchev's heart rate stabilized and his blood pressure began to improve gradually. The ashen color that had spread across his face started to fade, replaced by the slightly pink undertones that indicated better circulation. Dr. Vinogradov monitored these changes with the focused attention of someone whose career and potentially his life depended on achieving the right clinical outcome while navigating impossible political pressures. The sound of the cardiac monitor provided a steady electronic heartbeat that filled the room, punctuated by the occasional rustle of starched white uniforms as nurses moved efficiently around the patient. The smell of oxygen from the tank beside the bed mixed with the ever-present hospital odors of disinfectant and floor wax, creating an atmosphere that was both clinical and somehow deeply human. Throughout the night, Dr. Vinogradov remained at Khrushchev's bedside, adjusting medications and monitoring vital signs with the dedication that had made him one of the most respected physicians in the Soviet medical establishment. But beneath his professional calm, he was acutely aware that his decision to save Khrushchev's life had created a dangerous situation that extended far beyond the hospital walls. Intelligence archives from the period reveal that Stalin maintained an extensive network of informants within the medical community, and it was virtually impossible to keep medical decisions involving high-ranking officials secret for any significant length of time. The doctor knew that by morning, reports of Khrushchev's survival would reach Stalin's inner circle, and questions would inevitably arise about why a patient who was supposed to die had instead made a remarkable recovery. How many of you have family members who served under totalitarian regimes and never spoke about what they witnessed? These stories are disappearing from history. Leave a comment now saying simply, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family's memory. You're preserving the record of ordinary people who faced impossible choices under extraordinary circumstances. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The political implications of Khrushchev's survival became apparent within days of his recovery. Stalin's reaction, when informed that his agricultural critic had not only survived but was showing signs of full recovery, was characteristically unpredictable and ominous. According to memoirs published by other Kremlin physicians after Stalin's death, the dictator's response was a mixture of apparent concern for Khrushchev's health and thinly veiled suspicion about the effectiveness of Soviet medical care for party officials. The exact words that Stalin used when confronted with this unexpected outcome were recorded by several witnesses and later documented in party archives. When Beria reported that Khrushchev had survived what should have been a fatal heart attack, Stalin's response was coldly philosophical. Comrade Vinogradov appears to be a very talented physician, perhaps too talented for his own good. We must ensure that such talent serves the state appropriately. The implications of this statement would become clear in the months that followed. Dr. Vinogradov's decision to prioritize medical ethics over political expediency had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate case. Within weeks of Khrushchev's recovery, the physician found himself under increased scrutiny from state security services, who began investigating his background, associations, and previous medical decisions involving high-ranking officials. The atmosphere within the Kremlin medical facility became increasingly tense, with staff members reporting unusual questioning by unfamiliar individuals who claimed to be conducting routine administrative reviews. Personal correspondence preserved in Dr. Vinogradov's family archive reveals that he was acutely aware of the growing pressure, writing to a trusted colleague. The practice of medicine has become more dangerous than battlefield surgery, at least in war. You know who your enemies are. The broader historical context of this incident reflects the paranoid atmosphere that characterized Stalin's final years in power. By 1948, the dictator's suspicions had reached pathological levels, and he saw potential threats in every aspect of Soviet society, including the medical profession that was responsible for maintaining his own health and that of other senior officials. The doctor's plot that would emerge several years later had its roots in this period of escalating medical paranoia, when Stalin began to view physicians as potential assassins rather than healers. Intelligence reports from the period, declassified during the Gorbachev era, show that Stalin had become convinced that Western intelligence services were attempting to eliminate Soviet leadership through medical manipulation, a belief that made every physician in Moscow a potential suspect. Khrushchev's recovery progressed steadily throughout the spring of 1948, and by summer he had returned to his duties within the party apparatus. But the experience had changed him in subtle ways that would not become apparent until years later. Medical records indicate that the heart attack had been genuinely severe, and his survival was due entirely to Dr. Vinogradov's skilled intervention and willingness to ignore political considerations. Khrushchev himself seemed to understand the significance of what had happened, though he was careful not to acknowledge it openly during Stalin's lifetime. Private conversations recorded by family members and preserved in the Khrushchev family archive suggest that he was deeply grateful to Dr. Vinogradov, and that this gratitude would influence his later actions as Soviet leader. The irony of the situation would become apparent only in retrospect. Stalin's attempt to eliminate Khrushchev through medical neglect had been thwarted by a physician whose conscience prevented him from becoming an instrument of political murder. But in saving Khrushchev's life, Dr. Vinogradov had unknowingly preserved the future of Soviet reform and the eventual exposure of Stalin's crimes. The man lying unconscious on that hospital bed in March 1948 would eventually become the leader who delivered the famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956, publicly denouncing Stalin's purges and beginning the process of de-Stalinization that would transform the Soviet Union. Dr. Vinogradov's fate, meanwhile, became increasingly precarious as Stalin's paranoia continued to escalate. By 1952, he was arrested as part of the fabricated doctor's plot, accused of planning to assassinate Soviet leaders through medical malpractice. The charges were completely false, but they reflected Stalin's growing conviction that physicians represented a threat to his security. Interrogation records preserved in the FSB archives show that investigators pressed Dr. Vinogradov repeatedly about his treatment decisions for various officials, including the specific case of Khrushchev's heart attack. The doctor maintained his innocence throughout months of harsh questioning, insisting that he had simply followed established medical protocols without regard for political considerations. The connection between Dr. Vinogradov's medical decision in 1948 and the eventual transformation of Soviet society represents one of history's most remarkable examples of unintended consequences. When the physician chose to save Khrushchev's life, he was acting purely on medical and ethical grounds, with no awareness of the patient's future historical significance. The sterile hospital room where this decision was made gave no hint of its eventual importance, and the sound of medical equipment monitoring Khrushchev's recovery provided no indication that those electronic beeps were marking time toward a future denunciation of Stalin's regime. The technical aspects of Dr. Vinogradov's treatment were later studied by medical professionals as an example of effective emergency cardiac care under extreme pressure. The digitalis dosage he administered was precisely calibrated to achieve maximum therapeutic benefit while minimizing the risk of toxic effects, and his monitoring protocols ensured that any dangerous side effects would be detected and corrected immediately. Medical journals from the 1950s, after Stalin's death, had made such discussions politically safer, noted that the Khrushchev case demonstrated the importance of maintaining medical objectivity even under extreme political pressure. The treatment had succeeded not because of any special techniques or experimental procedures, but because a skilled physician had applied standard medical knowledge with unusual courage and dedication. Stalin's death in March 1953 changed the political landscape dramatically, and many of the charges against Dr. Vinogradov and other physicians in the doctor's plot were quietly dropped. The new leadership, which included Khrushchev as a prominent member, recognized that the medical conspiracy charges had been fabricated for political purposes and that the accused physicians were actually victims of Stalin's paranoia, rather than genuine threats to state security. Dr. Vinogradov was released from prison and eventually reinstated in his medical position, though his health had been severely damaged by months of harsh treatment and psychological pressure. Khrushchev's rise to power following Stalin's death brought the story full circle in ways that few observers could have anticipated. The man whose life had been saved by Dr. Vinogradov's ethical courage became the leader who exposed the brutality and paranoia of the Stalin era to the Soviet people and the world. The famous secret speech delivered to the 20th Party Congress in 1956 detailed Stalin's crimes and marked the beginning of a new era in Soviet history. While Khrushchev never publicly acknowledged the role that Dr. Vinogradov had played in his survival, those close to the situation understood that the physician's decision in 1948 had preserved not just one man's life, but the possibility of reform and revelation that would eventually transform the entire Soviet system. The medical equipment that had monitored Khrushchev's recovery in 1948 was later donated to the Central Medical Museum in Moscow, where it stands as a reminder of how individual ethical decisions can have profound historical consequences. The cardiac monitor, with its primitive electronic components and hand-calibrated settings, represents a moment when medical science and human conscience converged to alter the course of history. Visitors to the museum often ask about the significance of this particular equipment, unaware that the steady electronic heartbeat it once monitored belonged to the man who would eventually challenge Stalin's legacy and begin the process of Soviet reform. Dr. Vinogradov continued practicing medicine until his retirement in the early 1960s, but he rarely spoke publicly about the events of 1948 and the political pressures he had faced during Stalin's final years. Medical colleagues who worked with him during this later period described him as a dedicated physician who had been profoundly shaped by his experiences under the Stalin regime. His commitment to medical ethics had only strengthened over time, and he became known for his unwavering insistence that medical decisions should be based purely on clinical considerations rather than external pressures of any kind. The story of Dr. Vinogradov and Khrushchev illustrates how individual acts of moral courage can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. When the physician chose to save a patient's life despite political pressure to do otherwise, he was acting according to medical ethics and personal conscience rather than any grand historical vision. The fact that his decision ultimately contributed to the exposure of Stalin's crimes and the beginning of Soviet reform was not part of any calculated plan, but rather the result of ethical principles applied consistently even under extreme pressure. Archives opened after the collapse of the Soviet Union revealed the full extent of medical manipulation that had occurred during Stalin's era, with numerous cases of physicians being pressured to alter treatments for political purposes. Dr. Vinogradov's case stands out not because it was unique, but because we can trace its consequences through subsequent historical events. Many other physicians made similar ethical decisions during this period, choosing medical responsibility over political expediency, but their cases were lost to history because the patients they saved did not later become prominent historical figures. The hospital room where Khrushchev recovered was later renovated and converted to other purposes, but a small plaque now marks the location where these pivotal events took place. The inscription simply reads, "In this room, medical ethics and human conscience preserved a life that would help transform a nation." The plaque was installed during the Gorbachev era, when the Soviet Union was undergoing its own process of historical examination and reform, and it serves as a reminder that individual moral decisions can have profound collective consequences. Khrushchev's eventual denunciation of Stalin, delivered 8 years after his near-fatal heart attack, shocked the Soviet Union and the world with its detailed revelations of abuse and paranoia within the highest levels of government. The speech described cases where Stalin had ordered the deaths of loyal party members based on suspicion and paranoia, rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. While Khrushchev never explicitly mentioned his own near-death experience, or Dr. Vinogradov's role in his survival, those familiar with the historical details understood that the speaker himself had been a potential victim of the system he was now exposing. The transformation of Soviet society that began with Khrushchev's revelations can be traced directly back to Dr. Vinogradov's decision to prioritize medical ethics over political pressure in 1948. The physician who stood in that hospital corridor, facing an impossible choice between professional duty and political survival, could not have imagined that his medical decision would contribute to exposing one of history's most brutal dictatorships. The sound of his footsteps on the hospital floor as he walked toward Khrushchev's room marked not just a medical intervention, but a moment when individual conscience altered the trajectory of an entire nation. This story demonstrates that historical change often depends on ordinary people making extraordinary ethical choices under extreme pressure. Dr. Vinogradov was not a political revolutionary or a freedom fighter. He was a physician who chose to honor his medical oath despite the personal danger involved. His decision to save Khrushchev's life preserved not just one man's future, but the possibility of truth-telling and reform that would eventually benefit millions of Soviet citizens who had suffered under Stalin's regime. The medical records from Khrushchev's treatment, preserved in the Central Party archives, show the careful attention to detail that characterized Dr. Vinogradov's approach throughout the crisis. Every medication dosage, every vital sign measurement, and every clinical decision was documented with the precision of someone who understood that his professional competence was being scrutinized for political as well as medical implications. The documentation serves as a testament to the physician's skill and dedication, but also as evidence of the impossible circumstances under which Soviet medical professionals were forced to work during this period. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about doctors who broke rules to save lives, leaders who challenged the impossible, ordinary people who changed history with courage and conviction. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Russia, Canada, Australia, Germany. Our community extends all around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone from your family served under difficult political circumstances. Just tell us you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Dr. Vladimir Vinogradov and his ethical courage don't disappear into silence. These people deserve to be remembered, and you're helping to make that possible. Note, this story is based on documented historical events and real historical figures, but some specific details and conversations have been reconstructed for educational and narrative purposes. The core events: Stalin's paranoia toward potential successors, the medical pressures faced by Kremlin physicians, Khrushchev's later denunciation of Stalin, and the eventual exposure of the doctor's plot as fabricated charges, are all historically documented and verified through archival sources.